good afternoon, students, good afternoon, colleagues, and good morning to today's speaker, Elisa Silva, somewhere near Boston, US. I'm Professor Tina Gregoric. I'm Research Unit Chair at the Institute of Architecture at TU Wien. The chair title or research unit title is Architectural Typologies and Design. So as part of a design studio and fab, which I'm currently teaching together with Eva Mair, and it's titled Brick Academy Goricko, we had huge plans to somehow invite the expert on bricks on several levels, which we will see in today's lecture, Elisa Silva, to somehow join us live in Vienna with her knowledge and expertise to be the critic or the jury member at the midterm presentation in Vienna, which was planned at the end of May. And then on that behalf, we would also organize a public lecture at that time in Vienna. So all this was planned pre-corona time. And then we had to adapt the plan. So therefore, we are today meeting everyone here through the YouTube and through Zoom. So just to somehow define a little bit of the background of this Brick Academy Goricko and why is it so important to have this relationship with experts from around the globe to join us on that. That design studio aims to research and develop a specific Brick Academy in this trilateral park in Slovenia, Austria, which is kind of in 3 countries, and Hungary, which addresses the potentials of the rural region. And of course, most importantly, its material resources and the importance of craftsmanship. And then we chose this kind of site in the village of Grad that will serve us as this kind of testing ground to see how we could research and manufacture the bricks and link it to the educational and participatory, let's say, institution. So this is somehow the link, the knowledge of the bricks, but of course the wider knowledge of Elisa Silva, being both extraordinary practicing architect and also extraordinary architectural teacher. I had the opportunity to meet Elisa and to somehow talk about architecture extensively last semester, where we were both guest professors at the University of Toronto. So that was a kind of an insight to the work, to the way how she's teaching, but also a little bit to the work that she's doing as practicing architect through her practice titled Enlace Arquitectura, which she somehow founded in 2007. And then 10 years later, she also founded Enlace Foundation, both established in Caracas, Venezuela. What is crucial is to understand that she somehow grew up between St. Louis, US and Venezuela. And this gives her a very in-depth understanding of 2 cultures, 2 languages, and especially the way, also the roles of architectural practice in the North and in the South, as she's referring to these 2 diverse cultural contexts. Her work was, of course, regarded as extremely important. That's why the invitation to this year's Venice Biennale somehow led to that, which hopefully is going to happen at the end of August, and maybe we see Elisa here back in Europe. So she proved with enormous amount of participatory projects in very specific settlements throughout Venezuela, but also through some project that she did in Mexico with the students, how to incorporate local knowledge and local problems with this kind of outer understanding and wider understanding of that. She also was able to build together with the larger community an extraordinary church, San Juan Maria in Media Legua in Venezuela, which I think we will be seeing also in today's lecture, which I'm really looking forward to. So just to somehow define the background of Elisa Silva, she was educated at Harvard GSD, and after her master's degree, she has been extensively teaching. Currently, she's teaching at Princeton University, but she has been also teaching at Harvard in Toronto, as I mentioned, and also in Caracas, Venezuela. So not to reveal too much, I think, Elisa, I'm really looking forward to hear your positions through your work, which would be extremely beneficial for the students of our studio and of course far beyond. So the Zoom is yours, the YouTube is yours, and we are really looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much for accepting it.
No, thank you, Tina, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to all the students. I look forward to a good exchange and discussion, hopefully at the end as well. And yeah, let's get started. I have, let's see, here we go. Try to find a way to share. I think I'll just share the desktop. Okay, can you see?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So I just, out of my own kind of desire to promote Venezuela a bit, thought I would start by giving a little bit of context. And if you have heard anything about Venezuela, especially in recent years, it can't be anything positive. So I'd like to bring a different perspective to it. It's so this is Caracas, the capital of the city where I work. And it's very iconically associated with this incredible mountain called the Avila Mountain. And you'll see at the top, if you see my cursor, a very distinct building called the Humboldt Tower. And Humboldt was a very important discoverer and signified many aspects about Venezuela for an international audience. It's a valley, very built. It's considered sort of a skyscraper city, not that they are terribly tall, but it's very dense and very much built as a conglomeration of several story tall buildings. And I like this photograph very much because it shows the mix of an informal type of production of city making, and here in the back towards the mountains, you see it again, with a modern typology. And this is a very kind of ubiquitous photograph that's often shown of the informal settlement Petare in the foreground, and that would be La Urbina, which is one of the neighborhoods, and the mountain to the right. But it's also very fortunate to have had an incredible production of modern architecture, and I'll just show a few examples. And this is sort of the baggage that any design practice contends with as they work in a place like Caracas. The Central University, the University of Venezuela, is a kind of considered a masterpiece. It's actually even a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. And I'm not going to go through it, but the entire campus was designed by a single architect, Carlos Raúl Villanueva, who himself was formed in Paris and very influenced at the beginning by the Beaux-Arts and then Le Corbusier's principles. And these are very typical scenes of just natural ventilation, because obviously we're in the tropics, so we don't have to consider seals of any sort. It rains a lot, so these pieces that you see right here are covered walkways that actually keep people from the rain, but also from the sun. And they are amazing engineering feats, cantilevered, only supported on one side with the logic of a shell structure. And this is another example as you walk into the university. Then there's a series of spaces around the main auditorium that are called the covered courtyard. ramps that lead into that main auditorium space. It's pretty famous because of these clouds, as they're called by Alexander Calder. We even have the largest Léger piece, which is this mural part of the library. And then other amazing projects, Geoponti's, I think, tour de force project is in Caracas. It's this house called Villa Planchard, or El Cerrito, which was built in '54. It's an amazing building today, a prison, and quite infamous. It's sort of the equivalent of the CIA's and headquarters in Venezuela, but it's a complete helix, actually a double helix, and was originally thought of as a linear shopping mall. And at the top, that little dome that you see is a Buckminster Fuller dome. And what I showed at the beginning, the crown of the Avila Mountain, this building by Tomás Sanabria, built in '58, a luxury hotel that included a pool, a casino, ballrooms, and you arrive there by cable car. So all of this has been very celebrated. It was part of an early exhibition at the MoMA, curated by Henry Russell Hitchcock and published. So in these years of the 40s, 50s, 60s, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, and potentially Argentina were really the countries where most of this production was being witnessed. And then there was a later exhibition not too long ago in 2016 that features all of this. So this is what's there, and also problematic for what modernity also denies, but we might get into that at the end. I'm hopeful that we'll have time to go through 4 stories now to enter into the topic of the lecture that have to do with bricks, with blocks. And I want to talk about what they mean and what they pack, sort of the title of the lecture, but very much in terms of their social agency, not a literal metaphor of makeup or materiality. So the first one, the church that Tina mentioned, is the San Juan Maria Vianney project. So here's Caracas, and what's gray is the Caribbean Sea. So La Guaira being the port city very closely connected to Caracas and where the airport is located. And here's Media Legua, which not so far away, but takes a couple of hours or a little more sometimes to get there because there aren't any direct roads or access. And it belongs to the kind of rural typology of in terms of its landscape. And what I want to highlight here is the fact that it's a very long project. The site was selected and the program decided in 2008, but it wasn't consecrated as a church nor finished, and it's still not entirely finished until 2018. And I won't go into the details, but it basically is determined by very significant points in its evolution, which were the donation that occurred at 2010 from the Fundación Advient in Essen, Germany, Deutschland, and then another important donation that came from Spain in 2015, and finally another one from Spain in 2017. So that's the justification for the length of time, other than the fact that it was very much a project of unskilled labor and you know, not a terribly large workforce at any one moment. So getting into the final stages here, we'll see some of this because after especially our conversation yesterday with the midterm review, I thought it would be pertinent to see all the discoveries that occurred during the construction process, right? So this is the landscape. It's been part of an agrarian reform where people like Rafael Monterrey and his wife Delia, through their parents, received a piece of property that they used to produce agriculture. This is kind of the landscape that you see in the surrounding areas. A lot of plátano or banana is planted here as well. And this site belongs to Rafael Monterrey and Delia, that they gave or donated to, at the beginning, the idea was to create a agricultural educational center that was part of the university, and that project never happened. And so for various reasons, some of them like a little bit political iffy, so I don't think I should mention them, but this was already flattened for that supposed project. And under kind of a vulnerability that it had of being used for a different purpose that the community didn't really want or welcome, they also recognized that they wanted to have a church nearby their settlement. So their local parish father, then Padre Abelardo Batso, was just an amazing man, an individual, supported the community in that thought, and without any research and not much of an idea of how he was going to go about that, said yes and took on the challenge. So they themselves planted this cross on the site to, talk about its future use as a very aspirational gesture. And here we see it again. So I had just moved to Venezuela then. My uncle is and aunt are both quite devout Catholics. Myself, not so much, but that's my heritage, and I've been raised and even went to Catholic school when I was young in Venezuela. So I definitely get the whole thing, properly trained. And anyhow, I tried as best I could to model the site. There isn't, we didn't have a topographical study or anything. And this was sort of the first idea that I came up with, was a way of pushing this towards the back, leaving a courtyard area at the front, and creating a gesture that would be counter to the slope of the the natural landscape. And an early kind of idea about how it would appear from the main road and in cinder block. And we will see how that makes sense. But you can see all of these constructions really have this sort of typology and language of using the cinder blocks and spaces between them to create ventilation. Here's the infamous cinder block. This is the most common material for construction by far in Venezuela. It's not carbon neutral by any means. That wasn't really a concern, I guess, back then when we were taking on this project. It was more feasibility in what materials could be found. Since I've been in Venezuela, there's been a horrible economic crisis that has only gotten worse, and the access to materials and the access to building and construction materials has always been precarious. Most anything they have has been built in this technology. This is their previous church that they had at an hour's walk away. And I'll jump in by also saying that I had come to Venezuela from Rome. I had been there for a couple of years as a fellow of the American Academy, something called the Rome Prize. And these were not the subject of my investigation or the reason I was awarded the Rome Prize, but I became so obsessed with patterns that had to do with pavement and cofferings, et cetera, that I couldn't help myself and just started exploring these patterns and their deformations. So I had that in my mind as I was beginning this project, and you can definitely see some of that influence in this other model, which was an early model. No laser cutters in Venezuela at the time, so this was all done by hand, but very interested in finding ways to bring that kind of local craft or that local way of bringing ventilation in, and that fascination that I had with deformed patterns. It also had to do with creating kind of an inverted entrance into the precinct, somehow extending the threshold. So you actually walk along the edge between the slope of the hill and enter from the back, so that this is not an entrance so much as a window towards the landscape. And here we can see basically what that was trying to accomplish. So if you come from the top of the hill, you would be able to zigzag down to the entrance. Or if you come from the front, you'd enter the courtyard first and enter from the back of the church after coming through the side of it. That would allow you to look at a tree that was existing and the cross that we had seen earlier. And each of the openings would be somehow featuring just the vegetation, which is pretty much the landscape. To the north, on clear days, you can get a view of the ocean. The church was also thought of in terms of having, for the day of its patron saint, a more massive congregation that could occur in that courtyard outside, sort of a la Rundschamp. And, normally the congregation would meet within. These are the 4 facades, and to produce them was not so much a very precise design, but more a system or a kind of an instruction, the way Solowitz projects are instructions. So the instructions here were to take the first 12 rows as solid, compact, sequentially laid bricks or blocks. But then from the 12th row up, so 13 on, each row would correspond to a distinct dimension. And these were spacers that I created and left at the work site, so that at each row they would use that spacer before laying the next block. So important to consider. Sometimes the pieces that need to be incorporated that are not building materials or are not necessarily part of the project, but that need to be designed in order to build it. Here's some of the sort of more final facades, a section going through the longitudinally and a transverse section where you can see its relationship to the slope. And yeah, an uncovered one with the interior space. So this, in order to accomplish this, thankfully my uncle, the same one I mentioned before, we both did this project completely pro bono. He is a civil engineer and a structural engineer. So there was a real openness on his part to figure out how we would be able to build this. I did not want to have any columns visible. I wanted the walls to be bearing walls, and yet they were going to have all these openings in them. So we'll go into that in a second. But now to go back to the social side of the story, with that cross that we showed at the beginning, a first mass was celebrated on Palm Sunday. And here's Padre Abelardo, who's just, the kind of instigator behind everything together with the community. And beginning to have a ritual assigned to this very specific place that would be foreshadowing its future use. So once the design was accepted by Padre Abelardo, we went, and this is Padre Abelardo's father himself. These are workers from the community. The man here in black is Padre Abelardo. This is my uncle over here. And they're putting out the stakes of how to lay out the floor plate in a very rudimentary way. And I have no idea how precise this might have been in comparison to the plans. We just did the best we could. Once that was laid out, then the floor plate was poured with concrete. And these rebars that I'll explain in a second are part of the beginnings of the wall structure, which are bearing. And again, celebrating Mass on the site. The rebars are inserted, or the blocks are inserted in the rebars, which are all the way anchored to the floor plate, as you saw. And as the blocks are laid, they are filled with concrete themselves. And that makes them become not only the block as an element, single unit, but it becomes a formwork to receive a more monolithic wall. And that's what made it structural, so that you didn't have to actually see columns interspersed along that facade wall. And again, remember, we don't have serious climate considerations. It's pretty much 70 degrees year round, or what would that be, like 15 or no, more like 20 degrees Celsius year round. You know, fog comes in, fog leaves, it rains, it doesn't rain, but not too much other variations. So the wall that you have on the inside and the outside are one, they are the same. You can start to see the configuration of the walls and the plan of the church, as I showed earlier. At different points, they will celebrate the cross and decorate it with flowers made out of recycled plastic. Once the 12 rows were laid, you start to see the openings appear, right? So for the openings, a brick usually will have, or the block, the cinder block, will have an edge that is accommodating for the mortar to become adhered with the next one. But when you're going to have an opening, you don't actually want that. So they were smoothed out. So there's a kind of a stack of bricks that were retrofitted in a way to accommodate for this this condition that they weren't going to touch each other. They were actually going to leave space between them. But the rebars continue to go further up. They become attached and come through the structure in spite of the opening. So they're woven in a way so that they can always be continuous within the cinder block. Some images as the walls are growing, and this would be the kind of confessionary area and a small sacristy for the priest. Here, so you can see how the rebars continue to be woven. They're not straight. They can actually bend as long as they're attached to one another. So that idea originally from the model is starting to appear here, where this structure would counter the slope of the land. Another site visit later on. So Delia, Rafael's wife, my uncle, and the two workers who happened to be there that day. The people that worked on the church varied throughout the years. They could sometimes be as few as 2 or 3 people, but they were always from the community. And they did receive payment. That was part of the cost of, so the cost of the church was materials and labor. This corner, which is towards the front, was terribly problematic. You have to kind of keep in mind that these people are completely unskilled, and I'm an architect with big ideas, but not terribly at that point knowledgeable about detailing. And although I gave them specific instructions to corner this one to the other, you can only wish that the corners, that the instructions that you give them are followed. Since we would go every 2 weeks or so because of the distance and the time, it was quite a challenge for myself to manage the moments when I would get very frustrated with the quality of the work, and the moments where I had to just kind of accept the complexity of this for the people who are working on the project. That's a frustration that I think a lot of people contend with. So as the walls grew, we had to bring in scaffolding, obviously, for the workers to be able to get to that height. And, tons of imperfections, but also a great deal of accomplishment, because it wasn't really that they had to follow, again, a particular design. It was just an instruction. Each row has a different separation, and it doesn't really matter so much how they fall on top of one another. So finally, we get to the point of the roof. This was years later. We're now at the second donation, which happened in 2014. And the beams that we were able to find are all, they're all 12 meter length beams that were then accommodating to this length. And the roof, we understood, was always going to be a very lightweight structure, because we could get, there are styrofoam panels that then have a sandwich effect with concrete on top and the bottom. And that's because we knew the production company, and we were able to get them to donate them. So here we see the walls as bearing that weight from the columns, and they would stick out at certain points. So the roof isn't coincident with the walls, it actually extends itself in certain points. And this is that entrance path that has a covering as you come towards the back of the site, which then you would enter here, as I had commented earlier. And here you see it in the different directions. So you would walk this way and then enter the church from the back. The front view. So the roof is just sort of this armature of beams at this point, but the walls are complete. And here you see it from the street, and that kind of peeking up of a hat in a way. Here you see the styrofoam panels that we had envisioned placing as the roof structure, and here you see them again. Because there wasn't a continuity in time, they were laid and exposed to sun, exposed to rain, and very much deteriorated by the time we had money again to recommence the project. So this proved to be a terrible oversight, because what happened is that the panels are no longer as thick as they needed to be. Therefore, the concrete would be very thin. The styrofoam got eaten away by sun and rain, and that when the concrete was poured, it was much, much thicker and therefore much, much heavier. So you can see quite a bit of where the styrofoam was eaten away by the sun. So here you can see what it looks like from beneath. You would also finish it off with concrete. Here's another detail of how that roof extends itself towards the front. And it was a great solution for having a smooth, sort of seemingly monolithic roof. Here's again my uncle, the priest's father. There's Padre Abelardo, and now two different people. Here's the donor of the site, Rafael Monterrey, and the rest of the crew who was working on the project at that time. So here we are, kind of trying to, this I just showed you to see how precarious this whole thing and how intrepid some of these people were in order to get on the roof and study this and decide if we were really going to actually pour the concrete on. And so all the, formwork was laid in order to receive this concrete that was going to be poured on top. Well, as I mentioned, it was too heavy. And here's my uncle, my uncle, structural engineer, seeing, as you can see, this is definitely sagging. And although the beams could actually take that, it looked ominous. People were very scared to, take all those wooden sticks basically from underneath. And as they let it go, the whole thing went boom, and a lot of cracking happened in the ceiling. So we had one beam left over, and the solution that we came up with was to actually strengthen that piece that was already poured with an extra beam, sort of prop it up again, adhere the iron beam to it, and metal is actually a material that's indigenous to Venezuela. You can extract it further south. Today, it's pretty scarce just for other economic reasons that I'm not going to discuss right now. But so we had that beam adhered it to the structure. another donation came, we were able to sort of finish off the facade. Although I particularly didn't mind the cinder blocks, people don't associate that with progress and wealth, and, you know, something finished was very important to the community. So I for that. And so now you're seeing it in two different moments, which kind of was a problem that we had to solve anyways. And here's the roof structure with a, I'll go into that now. And it had to be impermeabilized with bitumen. So the second material was is plastic, and it's pretty horrendous, but it was absolutely free. I won't exactly go into how we got it, but and this is sort of how it appears today. Not ideal, but something that I had to just sort of accept. We also then had the openings closed off, not with glass. There's no glass in the whole building, just with these iron sort of gates that are placed on pivots. So this is the one that goes towards the courtyard, and the one we're seeing here goes towards the north, toward the south. And then, you know, some of the objects that had already been accumulated by the community for the church. And here are two of the workers now trying to lay out the final flooring, which was a sort of a concrete floor, but now smoothed out to be polished and with a finished quality. The cross that we saw originally was replaced by this one, which is a metal cross. The other one actually rotted or got infested with termites. I'm not sure what the story was again, but it was important that that cross should be there. I'll show you in a second. And then the name was given to the church, Iglesia San Juan Maria Vianney, which I love to show this in a sense, because I mean, nothing about the church is perfect. Not even these letters line up perfectly. Everything is a bit, you know, a little bit off. It was consecrated in October of 2018. Here's Padre Abelardo, no longer the parish priest of this church, but still very connected with the community. And the bishop or the archbishop of the region that Media Legua belongs to came and did the whole ceremony of consecration. And I'll show you a bit of some of the celebration in a film at the end. The lights are provisional still. It's just a piece of wire with a bulb on it. And the benches, as you can see here, are not at all ideal. There are even pieces of that plastic roofing that piled on top of each other make this kind of provisional benches. But it was a full church that day. And as we left, because it was one of the latest and days that I think I had left in a while, and then we had light then, we hadn't had light before, I discovered this effect, which I hadn't really thought of. I had always thought of how the church was going to receive light from the outside in, but it never dawned on me how it was going to emanate light from the interior towards the exterior once it did have light. So I apologize for the quality, because this was a cell photograph that I took then. And so these are now photos taken by a colleague, a fantastic photographer, Carlos Ancheta, once the church was complete. And we stayed that day so that we'd be able to capture these images at night that I'm so fond of. That cross is the church's cross, and at least in my idea, that you would, through this opening, see a cross that's in the landscape beyond, that you would have encountered as you arrive, and then as you come into the church again, reconnect with, but from the interior. And the connection between these grates and the openings is obvious. They're just sort of a negative of one and the other. And this is not the day of the consecration, but just a normal mass being held on Sundays by the now practicing parish priest. And here you see the cross in the background. They insist with me that I messed up with the opening, that this should definitely be the opening. And so it's odd that you come in, if you do, from the side onto the altar. I don't argue with them, but it's just a sort of an issue of comic relief associated with the church now to always say that the architect messed up and didn't put the entrance in the right place, which I accept. And the way it works, I think, is just a testimony in a way to the perseverance of this community, to the ability to accomplish something that seems pretty far and ambitious. It took a while, it took 10 years, but it even surprises me. So I'll share this film if it works. I don't need to show the whole thing, but I wanted to show you guys some of the ways that the people are using it inside. Let's see if it works. Well, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be running. Well, that's okay. It was the people singing inside and so forth. Let's see if this one works. No. Okay, so I'll now more quickly go into the second project, which is a different use of a single unit. It's now a paver project. And it's this entire red streak that you see here on the map of Caracas. It was a project that was very dear to me because it's the pedestrian boulevard called Sabana Grande, which as a little girl, I used to love going there. I could get there on the metro on my own as a teenager and walk. And this kind of experience of urbanity was always amazing to me. So it has its kind of own history and has been recognized and published. But it was the passageway that linked the eastern areas of the city. So this would be the center of Caracas over here. And towards the east were places that people would go to for weekends or for, you know, if you had a disease, you might go there to get fresher air as a hacienda type of structure. And the path that links them is the Sabana Grande Boulevard today. I mean, over time, it became an urban street. It also became the line, but the metro, when it was built in the 80s, follows along that very same line. In 2001, it started to be completely full of informal vendors. I mean, to the point where you couldn't recognize it. It was difficult to walk. It caused a great deal of insecurity in terms of pickpocketing, et cetera. And it was then pretty much abandoned by most of the population, or a good part of it. It was not considered a place to go and not considered like a boulevard for strolling and so forth. In 2007, the government, and this is a funny story that if you're curious, but anyways, Chavez at that point decided that he was going to get rid of all of the informal vendors, and a competition was open to renew and somehow, you know, bring back some of the attributes that it had before and counter all of the damage that it had received with this very, very intense use as a site for informal settlement, for informal vendors. And we won that competition, fortunately, which was the kind of beginning of this project. So it was the Caracas Times Square, let's say, during the 60s, and a place that my uncles and aunts and my father remember as a cultural place that you would go to and sit out in cafes, sort of, you know, a bit of a Parisian aspect to it. Then the metro came in the 80s, which goes along in the east-west corridor of the city. And it was already starting to become a pedestrian space then. It was allowed for cars, certain vehicles only, and buses. And this pattern that you see in the pavement is made out of concrete pavers. They're called the Olympia Pavers. I'll show them to you in a second. Here it is, completely taken over by the informal vendors and then absolutely destroyed afterwards. These pavers, though, are very much a part of the identity and memory of this place. And I was, in formulating the project, really keen on keeping that identity, reusing as many of these pavers as possible because they're indestructible pretty much. And they have a curvilinear side, which is very distinct. They're called Olympia Pavers for whatever reason. And here, just all of that kind of destruction that happened. Going back to Rome, I had been fascinated with the San Pietrini, as they're called, these volcanic stones, as an expression of people laying them out. I mean, these curvatures are because of, the mason is on his knees on the ground, and as the hand lays each one of them down, it creates naturally, because the hand is an array from the center, a semi-arc. I was also very critical of kind of, in general, the way they always met the walls and facades in a pretty precarious, kind of haphazard way. Loved all of these Roman pavements that I came into contact with, and experimented in other divergences from my project in Rome, making this intervention for Notte Bianca, which was a pattern that is three-dimensional and becomes distorted because of that three-dimensionality. And then the projections on the pavement. Anyways, these were things in my mind and that I bring to you again as I approached this project, which was 1.6 kilometers long pedestrian boulevard, but it also included all of the cross streets, as you see here. So challenges in producing this project. So how do you even organize all of this? How do you, I divided it into these quadrants, but then each of these quadrants, like say, 7, would be itself comprised of all these tiny little rectangles that you see here. And, to be able to be very precise about all of the indications that each of these surfaces would receive. This image is not one that I produced. It was produced by the client and the construction company, but in a way separating out all of the phases that the project would go in through, because this pedestrian boulevard is very used, I mean, all the time, because it coincides with the metro line. It has a very, very intense pedestrian traffic. So how do you do this while allowing stores to continue to operate? How do you do this while people are still walking? The yellow was our very first piece, and then in time, each of these happened. I did not in any moment at all think that this project was going to be built, or much less completed. So the choice of the paver, which is the very same paver that they had before, was in order to say, okay, well, if they just do one little part of this, at least when it butts with the old paving, it'll be the same paver, and it'll merge in a more seamless way. Here I'm talking about how much the construction is a determinant for the design. I mean, what you see here are linings on the edges that are concrete, which allowed 2 different materials and 2 different times of construction. So you could have people walking along the center while these concrete edges were being poured, and then conversely have people walk on the concrete edges while the center was being adapted with the pavement pattern. Another part of the project that's very important is to separate it into segments, because as the concrete pavers are placed, you don't just kind of go ad infinitum. They have to pack in a determined area tightly so that they actually function as a sort of a fabric. And this is one of the examples of a more, each of these is 1 meter squared, and those have been defined in terms of their patterns. There are details that have to do with the edges of concrete. And as you see, most of the manholes and the services nicely pack into that edge. That was part of the benefit of that as well. And then a detail that has to do with drainage. This was a street that had 2 levels. And so the drainage was always a window drainage that had to be changed and shifted to this new design, which was going to contemplate 1 single level throughout. So details that had to do with the concrete and the pavers, the manholes, and then leveling the manholes with new surfaces that would meet the new heights of the street. We also incorporated pedotactile pavers for handicaps, and this is the first time that was ever kind of considered in Venezuela. So there's an interesting aspect of how do you level the site that I found very, very interesting. And because drainage is absolutely critical, leveling the manholes, as I mentioned earlier, this is the line where the old drainage went. So we had to construe the whole project to reuse that drainage. We didn't have the budget nor the complexity in order to, redo drainage. So this side and this side drains into a flat drainage system. And here you see it being adapted. And then the new wrought iron grills that were brought. This is really how pavement is done even today. It's pretty arcane kind of system of laying down first the under surfaces, which are sand, and allow for rain to filter in, and then levels with string to create the markings of the height that you need to reach. And then when there's a little bit more topography, how that's adapted. It's all pretty fascinating. I'm going to skip through these as you see the process of laying down the bricks. And then here are those joints that I mentioned to be able to separate the pieces, but also allowed the pattern to shift in direction, since the boulevard isn't actually straight. It does shift as well. And then sand is laid into it, and has to be vibrated so that the entire thing actually, as I mentioned before, locks in as a fabric, and then compacted. So the brick pattern is sort of the, I guess, most fascinating aspect of this, which has to do with a degradation of two colors given because they were in the original palette of the previous pavement. And my approach was to divide it into these 1 meter segments that would dictate how the pattern was going to be applied. And here what I show you is sort of a synthesis of how this story ended up unfolding. Here's my 1 meter patterns as I tried to ask them to follow, and the grave efforts that they had to go through in order to follow my patterns and then implement them. They would stack the number of dark and light pavers behind them in order to sort of act as a control. But then at one point, somebody came up with this fantastic idea, which was that it wasn't so much a determined pattern by each meter, it was actually figures. And it's true, that's the way it was designed. There were different figures that would become added onto 1, 2, 3, and then eventually make this degradation. So what they opted to do was to fill 1/2 with dark and 1/2 with light, and then extract the figures, which was much easier for them and much faster. So it's kind of wonderful when the workers up you on understanding the way things are constructed and built. So here you see those figures that they could read very clearly and arrange the pattern that way. We then had a period of adjustments because the particular nature of each entrance into each shop required level adjustments, which were not so well documented in the topography at the beginning. And anyways, and some clients such as McDonald's, which is this one, which just took over part of the public domain, and that was changed. Now we see some images at the end of the project. So the entire 1.6 kilometers were in fact built, and all of their cross streets, something that to this day I still cannot believe. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it just has a lot of intense use. The cross streets allow traffic to traverse the boulevard, and we had to come up with these bollards, which are pretty aggressive, but we tried several heights, and we had to get them all the way to 35 centimeters high before people stopped trying to run over them. Here's some other images. There you see the cross streets with the bollards and the pattern, which is mostly visible from above. And there's this entire boulevard is lined with tall buildings that each of those balconies and windows look down onto this. But it's also very much perceivable at the height of at human height. And again, some imperfections on all this, but I think what I take away from the first project that I showed, from the church project, which I think is resolved a bit better here, is that if something's going to take time, the design actually needs to reflect that. It needs to accommodate for use while it's being built. And that's something that in the church, I hadn't internalized. I mean, the church was really going to be finished when the roof was there, when everything was in place. Over the course of the time, it might have been interesting to think of a way of building a church that could be used in spite of the fact that it wasn't complete. In this case, in the Sabana Grande project, that I think was better understood. And the use of this paver was not only just a pragmatic one, but one that had to do with the identity of the people, previous to my generation, in my own adolescence and youth, and as this projects further. Here you see it from La Previsora. It's a tower on a particular day, and as it's used sometimes as sites for magicians and clowns and performers who make a living by showing their art on the street in the public space. Okay, so we're getting long, and I'll go more quickly now. But I think this will be interesting for you guys. It's the pavers in Mexico that are now adobe pavers. And they're related to the industry of mezcal. So here's a third story that's meaning embedded in a brick. Mezcal is made in these regions of Mexico. Oaxaca is the one down here. It also coincides with the areas in Mexico that I have the least development or the most impoverished, which are Chiapas, Guerrero, and Oaxaca, which is right here. Valles Centrales is very well known for its association with mezcal, but also in pre-Columbian times, it was a very significant civilization of Zapotecs who built something like this, which was the Monte Alban, and very important site, even today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Mezcal is made from all sorts of agaves. Any type of agave can produce mezcal, as in opposition to tequila, which can only be made with blue agave. Once the agave is at a particular level of maturity, which takes 7 years at least, this is an espadín that takes 7 years, then all of its leaves are chopped off. You get this kind of pineapple shape. They're weighed, they're cooked in these earth ovens, which require a good amount of wood. And so here you see the cooked piñas. And once they've been cooked, then they're minced or ground. They can be ground with a more with an animal and a cylindrical stone, or ground with a mechanical means, and it actually doesn't have a difference in terms of its taste. Then it's fermented in these large vats with water, and the water from the ambience is part of the terroir, let's say, of the mezcal. It can then be distilled either in clay pots like this, which are heated with wood fire. And this is a more artisanal, ancestral way of producing it, or it can be done in copper, what they call alambiques, for the distillation process. What's happening, though, is that mezcal is on the rise, very popular spirit, and all of these resources that it consumes and the waste that it produces are becoming ever more important and grave. So all the wood consumed for the cooking process is causing terrible deforestation, which you can see clearly in this image, and compared to years back was definitely not this sparse. People have difficulties finding sources of water. This is a water well built by Herminio, one of the mezcal makers for the company that I've been doing this research for. And it's dry by now because the water table just continues to go down. As the fermenting process begins, you have all of the fibrous material that is one of the waste byproducts. But another waste byproduct, which is pretty onerous, is this liquid that is at present just thrown into the ground any which way, and is acidic. The pH is 3.2, I believe. Tequila actually also produces that very same vinyasa or acidic, and it's also just poured into the ground, poured into rivers. A huge environmental scandal waiting to happen. Farms have, because agaves are now being sought for more frequently, their price has gone up, and so they're replacing their crops with agave monocultures, which ecologically are not that great either. So all of these issues, and many of them have other answers, but the waste byproducts, strangely, are part of the raw materials needed to make this particular approach to adobe bricks. And I visited Alejandro Montes, who has been working on this for several years, and he became an ally of our project and of the studio in Toronto, reviving something that's very much of part of their tradition. Adobe bricks have been their way of building for many years, until sort of modern times development has said concrete cinder blocks like the ones I used in the church are better, but it's very much an issue of a development agenda more than anything else, because thermically the adobe bricks perform much, much better. And of course, they're a zero neutral carbon footprint. In these vats, which are 1,000 liters each, what's been stored is that vinasa, that acidic byproduct. And what Alejandro's been doing is, with a little bit more of an industrialized in the sense that he's using a cement mixer, he mixes earth with the fibrous material that's being used is now the bagazo, the byproduct from mezcal, and the water, instead of water, is the vinasa. And here you see one of his workers actually filling the frame by hand of the mold. And this could really develop into a fantastic local industry associated with mezcal production, where you can have cisterns that accumulate that liquid, and then begin to, we've calculated the amount of labor and the brick production that could occur with this over the cycle of a so coordinated with the mezcal production cycle. And we tested this and showed it to the community so that they could sort of also get a feeling that this was very possible through our own examples. So here's the fiber being separated by some of the students, the mixing, which happened with our own feet, and then pouring them into the molds to create little by little these bricks. We were in a day and a half able to make something like 200 bricks. So just to give you a sense of the amount of time it requires and the labor involved. Students then took off with these ideas, and some of them coupled a ceramic art production with the mezcal production, because the firing in the kiln or the firing in the earth oven could actually be the same space. And then in terms of the time, you could cycle the two productions in order to take advantage of spaces while the others weren't occupying them. And this was Irene Wang's approach to the school. It incorporates 2 stories So there's some details here that are pretty interesting in terms of how to accommodate a second floor, and also struggling with ways to represent this that would be easily understood by the community. So kind of, being a bit more critical of our usual architectural ways of representing things. Also accounting for every last bit of material and how exactly these things are put together, and the precision of the assemblage. This is a project that Irina Rubio put together, sort of the dispersed in, but I bring it because, well, the simplicity of the projects, they're just really trying to make a room and a restroom, but again, detailing all of the materials that would be necessary. And I think the fact that they went and they were there and made the bricks themselves made them very keen that every brick was an effort, and to really try to take this to something feasible and something, quantify the amount of time that it would actually take to build. Ways to collect water, both from rain runoff, was also incorporated into some of these projects. This is a palenque with all the detailing of how the base has to be accommodated, especially if you're thinking of a terraced structure where the adobe brick cannot meet the ground, but then also a different way of making the ring beam out of fired bricks. And even as a way to contain earth and be able to accommodate, for example, this pool of water in order to collect and store enough water to complete an agricultural season was another project. And the need to reinforce that wall with, these are bamboo, very thin bamboo rods that are placed every row and give it sort of a structural solidity in order to be able to hold earth behind it. So now to end, the last story, and this is a brief one, has to do with informal settlements and the way that a brick as a unit is key in understanding the propensity and why this has actually been such a pervasive form of urbanization. So a few years ago, we hit the 1 billion mark of people living in informal settlements. And this is something that I've my Poe practice is very much centered on this. I won't go into it except to just understand this key issue about housing and aspiration. Slums or informal settlements will continue to grow. They're actually growing faster than the formal parts of our world, and will become 3.5 billion by 2050. And in our profession, we have celebrated architects such as Doshi or Aravena, who recently both received Pritzker Prizes for their work with housing as a given unit. Even if you can, end up building half of your house, this focus on a predefined housing typology, and then the other less, fortunate expressions of this require land that's often very inaccessible. And therefore, you're not building part of the city. You're building these extraterritorial spaces not connected to any kind of vitality. This is a project in Mexico. This is a terrible project. The materials aren't even from the place in Venezuela, because this was housing brought in from Uzbekistan through a Chavez program. But the key thing is to understand housing deficits are extraordinary, and to think that these are really approaches that make any sense is just sort of ludicrous to me. The amount of the population in Caracas that is considered to be without a home is the equivalent of a third. And that's the actual same proportion when you apply it to Mexico as a country's deficit of housing. So to provide housing at that level has a reason why that can't really work. In developed nations where social housing is something of an icon and a very, I think, important piece of the social structure, those people that require that kind of assistance are what's considered the poor, and they're at the very small bottom end of what society as a whole constitutes. But in developing nations, the people that are, and this is because of a historical tendency of inequalities and misdistribution, or an unequal distribution of wealth, the social housing actually is only touching a very small portion of that population. And therefore, as professionals and as politicians and as people, you know, involved in public policy, it seems just so strange to me to not understand this dynamic. We've mapped in Caracas all of the informal settlements, which you see here, and I won't go into that, but it was a titanic task that showed us that half of the population in Caracas lives in an informal settlement. And then we've continued to map other cities. This is Mexico, this is Rio de Janeiro, this is Lima, Medellin, and the ranges go between half and 30% and half of the population. Progressive construction, and this is an example that I bring from a study done in Lima, Peru, not by myself, is itself very well understood. You start with something small and you can grow. And that is it reflects your own livelihood and your prosperity in time as your income increases, as your family increases. Very well exhibited in images like this, where that kind of alto pattern happens here in a more organic way. And this is an artist in Venezuela called Alexandra Apostol, who's documented some of these crazy, I mean, this one is windowless for one, ways to build in time and progressively, right? But it's not just the unit itself that grows progressively, it's the settlement itself. And this is a study done of Rocinha in Brazil. An image from Caracas of a site where we ended up creating a public space. This is in Petare. So this aggregate is all enabled because of the single brick. And people make money, buy bricks progressively, until they have enough to maybe build that extra wall, build that extra room. It's a savings account, it's a bank, it's many things. It's not just a building material. And there have been studies in Venezuela by colleagues of mine who have really tried to understand this in terms of its form, which I think is part of the question. And it is pretty innovative the way that, especially with these topographies, people are able to reconcile an adaptive approach to the topography, but also of their growth in time. It's a more recent study by Ana Vargas that I really appreciate in terms of trying to document in plan what's going on in form. But I think the important thing here really is to see what that enables in terms of a family. And I wanted to show you other images. I wasn't able to find them because our server is out of communication because there was a power outage in Caracas. But this is a piece of our newspaper of a project that we've been doing in La Palomera. And I think it's also a pretty interesting way. We were explaining how this complex housing unit works. And it is not just a housing unit. It is also a place with beauty salons, mechanical shops, seamstresses, small convenience stores, places where to have your nails done. Even sometimes small evangelical churches will accommodate themselves inside these soup kitchens, and of course, exterior gardens and places to cultivate, which is part of another project. But this is important to understand. This is a complex unit. It's not housing, it's many more things. It's a productive space, and it has the ability to adapt itself in time, thanks to this unit of the brick that allows people to enable their advancement as a family and as a society, which is why I bring this book, Arrival City by Doug Sanders, where he just goes through so many stories of understanding informal settlements as an aspirational space, as a place that enables families, even if it's over generations, to improve, to access education, to access different things that the city establishes. So in wrapping it up, the bricks allow a community to participate with low skill. They can become part of an identity or memory. They can be part of a circular economy that rescues cultural traditions and even mitigates waste. And it is part of an aspirational trajectory of many people's lives, of 3.5 billion people's lives in this world. So with that, thank you very much, or Dankeschön. And I will now end the sharing.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry you can't hear everyone else who is listening and was watching your talk through the YouTube. I think it was, thank you for this kind of in-depth presentation of a few projects, because I think that's so crucial for the students and also for us, the colleagues, to somehow understand that whatever it takes to produce any of the architectural projects. Of course, it's very different in different contexts, but all this technical knowledge is so crucial in order to realize something on any level.
Right.
Of course, and what is always important, and we discuss that quite often with the colleagues, that actually the conditions within you are producing architecture are crucial for adapting your practice to the local conditions of the production of the architecture itself. And it was so evident from your talk how your obsessions or knowledge that you encountered either through Harvard and then further through Prix-de-Rome, you kind of incorporated in this kind of 10-year-old participatory pro bono project. Yeah, I appreciate so many things. So maybe I'll just comment a little bit and then ask questions. And there are a couple of questions also on the YouTube. So I think I've seen the church before. I tried to understand it. I think it was really interesting to show us how you adopted the ready-made piece in order to somehow make the join for the windows. I think this is really crucial also for the students to understand. So, and also you were always referring to all these material resources with this kind of knowledge of the circular economy on a larger planetary base. So maybe let's start with this first question, I think, because I think just recently, slowly, we as architects have started to address the issue of material resources, and we became aware that we are helping to contribute to an enormous carbon footprint just with wrong decisions, either being on an urban scale, which is even more problematic, or also on the architectural scale. And how can you just comment on this like larger topic of material resources, carbon footprint, and how knowing that you always adapt to it?
No, it's a great question. And I mean, I think a good example, for example, is Caracas itself, which it boomed in the 50s and 60s when we really believed the car was just this fantastic thing. And very unfortunate that we had money from petroleum, and this was the going vogue at the time, because the city is just traversed with highways, and it negates the river that goes through it. It makes it really difficult for a lot of parts of the city to actually be communicated in a non-vehicular way. And so in this moment right now, not just because of the coronavirus, but because of all of the sanctions that the US has been imposing on any entity that negotiates with Venezuela as a kind of a pressure to get the government change to happen. Who knows if it's going to be effective? There is absolutely no gasoline right now in the country. And so vehicles are, what are they for? They're just accumulating, using up space and accumulating dust. And it's made the city so obviously designed in a non-sustainable way that I hope some reflections come from that, as opposed to just vilifying you know, the situation in the government, et cetera. But we have historically made, at an urbanistics level, very naive decisions, really believing in progress, really believing in this modern agenda, that was infallible. And so I find that, for example, when you go to sort of housing at a social scale, you know, after the tragedy that happened in Haiti, I got so tickled by seeing all sorts of US architects, especially, proposing prefabricated housing units that cost, they were like only $20,000. And you're like, $20,000. I mean, do you know the church cost $40,000? It's and they're, you know, small units of 25 square meters. The naivete, in a way, I think it just comes from not putting yourself really in the position of others. These people in Haiti have a lot of labor, a lot of unemployment, a different kind of climate that doesn't really adapt to these sort of polymer-based prefabricated structures. So I think the one is the material choice, for sure. One is the availability that it might have, which has to do with economic kind of forces that one as an architect doesn't really control. But I think in the design, you always have every outlet possible. The design can adapt to all of these measures. And I think there's one is to make it didactic, so that, you know, whoever comes into contact with this is somehow benefited from seeing those choices take place. And on the other hand, I think we really need to have this kind of architect that is a friend of people, that, you know, that becomes embedded with people. I took the students to Oaxaca, and that we slept at people's homes. We worked with the community. You know, they asked all sorts of questions, even in spite of the fact that not all of them spoke Spanish. And when they came back, they designed in a completely different way. I'm convinced of that, because they were like, well, that's unrealistic. So-and-so can't carry that. So-and-so can't live without income for X amount of time. This has to happen in parallel with other dynamics. So it's, as you say, it's not just the material and whether the material has a closed carbon cycle. It's the family and the local economy and the availability of materials, and you know, the amount of time that it will take. And if we can plug ourselves into that kind of what do you call it? Empathy, and find those things to be part of the equation. Like, I'm not just designing something formal. I'm designing or trying to make this fit into this larger puzzle of things. And I'm designing in a way how this fits into all those other pieces, even if it has to do with educational initiatives. So like the newspaper that I showed at the end is a piece of an exhibition, but it's also been used in many other ways. Just this ploy to bring information to people in a way that's not, you know, that's curious, and that maybe allow them to think of a house, for example, in an informal settlement differently than the way they've thought of it before, because they've thought of it as an aberration, these illegal people, these, you know, they don't want to live in better conditions. And it's just really important, I think, that we become advocates of sharing ways for people to understand things differently, because what's going to happen? We'll continue down a path of funding social housing projects in the future. And I don't feel that that's going to have any sort of real impact. It needs to be something that reflects the fact that a house is complex, that it's productive, that it grows in time, that it needs to be connected to the ground floor, that it has, you know, gardens in it. If we don't understand that, then we'll allow all sorts of processes to continue to occur that are those bad decisions that you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, let's continue with housing because, I mean, you were addressing so many different
Yeah.
issues. I mean, we have been researching the issues of social housing for a very long time, but of course, from the perspective of a European architect, and especially Vienna, as you probably know, it's like one of the two world capitals where the core of the city is actually the social housing, which is addressing the medium strata of the society, or everyone, not actually just the bottom poor. So it's completely different agenda, but it's but also in the system of how it's produced. There we should look for the changes, and the same is happening here in Ljubljana when we are currently also producing the second social housing project. I think it was very brave and important that you also highlighted the problems of Alejandro Aravena and Endoshi, because it's something that, you know, we as architects have been exposed many years ago, and these were kind of the heroes from the developed world, but we should be able to understand that this is not the perfect way how to approach it. And to me, it was always extremely painful to see, you know, Venice Biennale, where some Swiss architects / professors were doing projects in informal settlements around in Latin America without any understanding of the culture, of you know, of the people and the potential of those people that you can integrate in the projects if you start to understand. Of course, I was not fortunate enough to be ever visited, but we had a Brazilian architect working in our studio for 3 years, and he was extremely involved with that. So I think, and also because we had this opportunity to build in a tropical climate, although in Hawaii, I completely understand that if you don't understand the climate, then you cannot understand the building technology, then you cannot make the design decisions, and then it's unbelievable to even think that a US architect could send a 20,000 project with plastic to Haiti. But I think that then every course that you are teaching, or anyone is teaching, that it's really bringing this kind of, you know, dichotomy of understanding the world a little bit closer together. It's really crucial. And I think, you know, we are sending students to Africa, or in US to Latin America, to start to work in one-to-one and try to build something. But this is also hugely questionable, because there is also huge unemployment also in Europe, and now it's increasing, of course, with the coronavirus. There is also, I think there should be also an informal way of contributing to our environment, because we have completely different problems. We are trained to design for something that you will never meet the worker at the end. And I think this is super problematic. And we've seen that only students who were ever exposed with the physical work, and with really working either with concrete, with wood, with bricks, they appreciate the scarcity of the material, and they really think from the material outwards, not just somehow inventing that this is, you know, the overall agenda. So just to somehow, so I think from the social housing agenda needs to be so adapted, I think, in each local community. And I think the more we speak about that, the more we map the reality, but the more we want to somehow incorporate the residents themselves into building their own homes. And this has been historically the most normal way. So you know, and we are now forbidding that in Europe. So I don't know, do you have any comment on these agendas? Because we are losing that.
No, it's super interesting. I think in the case of, you know, developed nations, or, you know, Canada, United States too, the litigious aspect, and like having insurance for all of these things. I mean, there's other industries that have come in to inform a lot of what makes it so much more difficult, I think, to have a more organic process happen. So in the seminar that I taught at Toronto last semester, it was super interesting, because although the examples that I brought were from Latin America as this kind of you can tell from this lecture, I mean, there's like this modern progression of design, and then there's this other one that's happening that is perhaps even more valid, that doesn't have to do with the heroics and is organic. But if you go to developed countries, sort of in Canada, there apparently have been approaches to, you know, a self-built home or something like that. But then the legal aspects make it so difficult for that to happen. It's sort of in a way like they are protecting their métier. Mm-hmm. That it's not even feasible for an architect to go down that path. And you know, to be that naive, I think as an architect, I think that it's just really about empowering people and, you know, creating a system that's participatory. I think we really need to take on these other issues like the insurance agencies and the legal aspects, and, you know, try to foment a larger discussion about this and see if there are opportunities for that to be adjusted so that we are, you know, I think the possibility for a more organic way of building progressively, you know, could creep in if these other aspects allowed them to. I don't think it's against human nature, nor do I think it's necessarily against our facility as professionals, as designers. I really do believe there are forces that come from other aspects that are really putting the kind of constraint on that.
Exactly. We have to, I think it's our duty as architects to try to challenge these forces and these systems that seemed unchallengeable or wanting to change. I'm going to ask certain questions from the feed Nicolas Montecchi Palazzi, he's asking you, what's your perspective? Which should be the steps to follow or the dynamic to generate a social housing project in a developing country, which you maybe mentioned already now, but do you want to further comment on that?
Okay, well, thank you, Nicolas. There are many actual proposals that already exist in place. It's something that's not really about reinventing anything new. It's called progressive urbanism, and this was developed in tandem, or even during the modern times, by, you know, John Turner or Peter Latz in Peru. Sites and services is something very similar to that kind of mentality. And David Gouverneur, who's an architect from Venezuela but teaches at UPenn right now, has a whole book called, well, he talks about armatures, and you create the space for this to happen, as it does right now, where people self-build their homes, but you reserve and safeguard all of that equipment and all of that space that in the end needs to be public. That is precisely what never happens in informal settlements. The public domain isn't isn't what people are working on from their own family unit. And so this has had, I think if I had more time, but I already went over terribly. I had two examples, which are built examples. One in Peru, in Lima, which is Villa El Salvador, which was built in the and after an earthquake that displaced a whole bunch of people. I believe it was like in the late 60s, early 70s, in the southern part of Lima. And they came to an agreement with the mayor at the time, who was a leftist leaning mayor, and set out a grid that people could then have plots of land and build progressively over time. And it incorporates roads and public space and spaces for a market and spaces for a university even. And in Mexico City, there's Ciudad Neza, which was also very similar to that. And you know, despite some of the problems that it may have in terms of the land that it's on, because it's on top of what was a lake, and so it gets often flooded, the urban structure is actually very, very sound. It's mixed use, lots of commercial entities, lots of ways people produce income. It has areas that have been safeguarded for hospitals, for stadium, for schools. And it has seamlessly, I think, become city fabric itself too. So that we don't have to come up with new ideas. They exist. They're already out there. Yeah.
Exactly. I was fortunate enough to work with a student, Osama Mulgami, and he was doing his diploma work on a Gaza Strip self-built housing. So actually in the Gaza, it was very, very similar how all these self-developed structures within even more dense and confined ways, because there is this huge border and then this kind of density there. And of course, how to react on that and how to integrate this mentality of defining the grid and just, you know, the non-buildable place, which belongs to the public in the near future. It's a crucial point, I think.
Yeah.
But I always, you know, I always think that people from those environments are the ones who should be dealing with these issues within their own countries, and we should learn from, but try to do something in the context that we understand. And it's not perfect either, you know. So I have this, I think you need a deeper understanding of the culture in order to try to help otherwise. There are some additional questions for you, which are more related to exactly to your project. One was, how many local workers were involved in the construction process at the time? I think that is meant for the church.
Yeah, I think I tried to mention that briefly, but very few. There was, sometimes it would be two, one of them as like a kind of a slightly more expertise person with a helper. Sometimes it got up to 5 or 6. It also depended on the cash flow that the project had. It wasn't only a matter of, and we didn't feel it was right for people to work in this kind of a, you know, community, in these sort of financial circumstances that they have without pay. So yeah.
That's crucial, I think, to somehow understand that. And the second was to your boulevard project, the pavement. It was which tools were used in order to avoid damage to the existing pavement during the deconstruction, or how you approached?
Oh no, it's quite incredible. The pavers are always laid into sand. I mean, even stone pavers are laid into sand. So what's fantastic about them, even if it's not just like a complete remodeling, but you're going to, I don't know, put in a new piece of service, or you need to, you know, adapt existing ones, or there's a leak in some pipes, or you can just take these pavers out, access the area that you need to work on, and put them back in. And because the ones that had been used in the 80s had cured for all this time, so they, you know, concrete cures mostly right after, but it continues to cure in time. They were hard, you know, they're like indestructible.
Okay.
So it was actually quite simple. They needed to be power washed, that's for sure, with hydrojet. But
I mean, it's incredible, because we were dealing with another stretch of the main street here in Ljubljana, and we used the same, not the same shapes, because we were able to shape them as a project, but with the same system, you know, of this kind of concrete pavers, because precisely what you are saying now, they allow for future remodeling of any installations if needed, because they are laid in the sand itself, and it's quite cheap, and you can really control it in a very good way. And of course, you can build with the pattern, the identity that actually kind of, you know, builds with the history of the place and so on. And also, you know, the reaction of the people is then towards the pattern, or towards the ways that you allow for this public place to happen. In order, of course, I knew a little bit more about your project with the Adobe bricks because of the mid-presentation of your students now, and of course I've seen the work, the final work now, which is really fantastic, and also for the publication you were willing to share with our students. So therefore, maybe I will ask now Eva Mair, my colleague, where we teach together, Brick Academy. Eva. Please do have some questions regarding that, so or anything that Elisa was speaking today.
Yeah, I was wondering, because as you say, it's always a question also of availability of material. And you were saying that in Venezuela now it's almost only cinder blocks that are available. Is there any production in Venezuela of or clay bricks or adobe bricks, or is this only if you're doing yourself the manufacturing of the bricks for your own house, or is there anything going on in another direction of material production, more sustainable thoughts on material production?
No, I think there is no country, perhaps a few in Africa, that's more backward in this moment, or more distant than the reality of, say, Austria or Germany than Venezuela. No one has even a hint of an agenda that has to do with sustainability or a carbon zero footprint of material production. The economic situation is dismal, terrible, only getting worse. Every year we've had negative growth. It's projected to be 20%. Inflation is like above the 1,000%, worse than, Germany after the war. It's like a place that if you haven't been, exposed to this, it sounds all unbelievable, but trust me, it's all true. So there's nothing really being produced right now. But I will add an anecdote that I think is a bit an answer to your question. Is I have a cousin who has decided on her own to live in a secondary city of this. So most people live in the capital. She lives near a secondary city called Barquisimeto, but not even there. She lives further out, and she's been producing cheese with goat milk, and she's just kind of gone into a different mode of, and she has a center where she teaches children music of this community. And they're all very, children with tremendous needs and tremendous psychological gaps as well. But after she saw the church project and she saw a little bit of the work I was doing, she was so excited and contacted me, and she said, I thought that you could do earth construction. And she was, relieved because it wouldn't really require a big investment in terms of materials. And I was very supportive of her thought. She'd like to make more spaces available for these children to begin an earth project there with her. And so, when circumstances allow and when I can convince her and we can try to do it together, I definitely want to take her on that idea and try to show people, that's the same idea of the studio was, okay, earth construction's always been considered, at least adobe brick construction, something that's very much of poverty. And so the United Nations guidelines at some point even stated that if you had a dirt floor, your house was part of the poor category. Design, and this is Anna Heringer's agenda for sure, is able to sort of transform that material and represent it to people so that they don't have necessarily to consider that negative poverty, a stigma associated with it. So, with her as a client and this idea, I hope we have a chance to put that together. But unfortunately, that there isn't any kind of national production. Yeah,
a little bit of awareness in some of the people that are there. It's already something.
Yeah.
And the other question would be the students that you were teaching this course in Oaxaca.
Mm-hmm.
Oaxaca, sorry. They produced bricks themselves, no? And were they able also to build something, or this wasn't the aim of the design course?
No, they weren't able to build anything. It wasn't also the aim. We didn't have enough time to actually let them, because they have to dry for at least a week. After you set the block, they have to be exposed to the sun. They have to dry for at least a week. Then you move them, and in the end, it has to be like a 30 or 40-day period. So we would have had to, build something with previously configured blocks. But what happened also is that it rained. I think I mentioned that yesterday.
Yeah,
so
you mentioned.
We weren't able to make as many as we wanted to. But together, we kind of came up with a way for Herminio, he's the mezcal maker, and we made them on his property. He has his factory or palenque where he makes mezcal. And some of it's been haphazardly arranged with metal sheets that he, has slapped on, like no aesthetic concerns whatsoever. So we were talking to him about how he could use those bricks and, exactly showing him in what way he could replace those enclosures out of metal tin with the bricks. So we experimented just with sort of a plausible project of what to do with those bricks.
Okay.
But
and all these ideas that students had to like link this production of mezcal with the production of brick, is this going on now somehow in the region? Are there
so
people that are connecting to these ideas and to this agenda that the students like wrote on?
So Alejandro Montes, who was part of our workshop, and he came and taught the students how to do it. He's been doing it himself with other mezcal makers as an independent architect. He has an amazing initiative called COAA, which he has an Instagram account and everything else. So he's been hired by the local government or the state government for new housing projects in the south, which was a part that was more affected by the 2017 earthquake towards the isthmus of Oaxaca. And he's been contracted by more wealthy clients who've been doing rammed earth projects, or kind of in the sense of the Martin Rausch larger blocks that we saw. He has something similar to that too. And then there's a studio in Oaxaca called Root Studio. So root as in, like plant root, doing really fantastic work with Adobe bricks as well. This is something that exists in the heritage of the site. I mean, it's the people themselves who came up with that innovative way of using the waste to make bricks. So he just talking to people and rescued this, and has been trying to find more people to support him. So we would just like to, he has this as an open source system. So, adhere ourselves onto his project, or, likewise, and make it more and more part of the mainstream way to deal with these waste products. And just recently, last week, I had a conversation with a company that bought the previous company, or is a large owner with US-based operations, and explained all of this to them. They were very interested. So hopefully not so slowly, this will be able to.
So maybe this also for our students, connecting with people, with farmers and so on. It's, I think, always important to get to put the ideas in the right sites or right minds that could pick them up, and maybe in a second step or however. So we also for sure with Tina are planning a publication, and then maybe to bring the ideas further. So I think this is always good.
Or maybe you could program a town hall presentation at the site.
Exactly. So basically we will go back wherever it's possible and try to gather, because we have really good local connections, with the lady who also gave a talk to the students. She's running this kind of castle and this Goricko landscape park, but she's also super knowledgeable about knowing which farmers to include and which are actually progressed enough to do some changes. So I think that's really, really important. I mean, this is also what we are all trying to teach always with the students. So whenever they do a diploma or a project that it's dealing with the real community, with the real space, that they should be presenting it in the municipality to the local administrators, but also to the local people, in order to somehow push it forward in whatever way. But we need to somehow facilitate this kind of progression and this activity, and we need to somehow support it in order to somehow start off something else. What you've showed today is that every initiative has a really long time span. I think that's really important to understand. The students, also the discussion we had last week with nanotourism workshops that Alyosha and Jakob are doing around the world, because One thing is to bring awareness to the students, which you expose to that particular Adobe brick or the scarcity of the water or any other resources on that place. But the other thing is how to keep these things running with some local initiative that in your case you have the architect colleague that is continuing that. And I think that's the important, if you want, and of course this what you just mentioned now, that once the bigger players, the industry starts reacting and starts to integrate this initiative, then we will be doing a major ecological, let's say, change, which is of course going to be visible on a larger agenda. So I think these players could be super small or extremely large, and yeah, this we have to address both of them. Yes.
Yeah.
Agenda.
No, and definitely what Eva mentioned about finding the innovative or the more experimental person on site who's willing to maybe try some of these things. That person's very important too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's individuals. It's always the individuals. I don't believe in large institutions or anything, because the power of individual and then subsequently the community is so much important than whatever it's imposed on that. So that was also a question of one of Oliver from YouTube. Hi Lisa, how was the reaction from the side of the mescal farmers regarding the research about the mescal brick? So you answered a little bit, but maybe you can extend on that.
Yeah, no. So I in addition to the brick studio, we did a studio at Harvard that was sort of larger in scale and a look at the landscape and some of these other elements that I mentioned, like water and wood, and sort of how to address the production of agave in the future too, as a source of income. I mean, it was very large, and the bricks came from that study that then the Toronto students plunged into even further. So I've had in each of the towns my own town hall meeting where I went and presented all of this. I translated it all into Spanish, and the way that you ask everyone to come is not very conventional. They have a loudspeaker, and they'll announce on the speaker, you know, everybody come for they fortunately remembered me because it's sort of conspicuous for a person to come from outside in and of itself, and then I'd have all these foreign people, you know, with me. So they would remember. And I think they were first very appreciative that, you know, there was an effort to come back and share the results. They have Facebook accounts, so they use that mostly as a way to disseminate information. So I parceled the information into pockets of things that they could upload on their, some of them gave me their password and name, and I did it myself on their own Facebook accounts. The response was amazing, because each of the projects, from both of the studios, were actually thought of in a way that was plausible, that made sense. So making the bricks, for example, Herminio and he had his brother and he had his brother-in-law come over, and they had done bricks themselves, not with the waste products, years ago. And, you know, kind of with the whole idea that cement blocks are better or whatever, let that aside. And I've just been saying, like, oh, isn't it so much cooler in your, you know, the house that you grew up as a child? And they, you know, hands down, yes. And they saw how relatively, I mean, it's laborious for sure, but it's inexpensive because the materials are, you know, essentially nothing. Got very excited about thinking, you know, about implementing it further. The part that's, I think, complex to figure out is how to make the factory of that. So I think it's easy to think of how each person might make the bricks that they need for a project, but to get this into something that's a continuous production cycle for, you know, any number of projects where people might come and take the bricks with themselves. That's I think a hurdle that we still haven't addressed completely. But the openness to reconsider it, I think is there. I need to go back and share with the community now the projects from the Toronto students. I haven't done that yet. And what we chose to work on were inns, mezcal making spaces, which have to increase in number given the demand for mezcal and the economic opportunity that means for the people. And the other one were art centers, which we've seen in Oaxaca because it has a culturally significant value, and they've been very successful in different parts of Oaxaca. So I brought a few clay pieces that are made in another place, maybe just 50 kilometers away. And I had asked them once, like, do you guys have clay? I'm sure you do. And, you know, nobody really responded. So I came back this time with pieces that I had purchased and I showed them to them, and beautifully crafted. Just, I'd have my whole entire kitchen just of these Oaxaca ceramic pieces. And I asked them, you know, how much do you think this sells for? And they would quote something very low, like, I don't know, 40 pesos. And I'm like, no, this is 350 pesos. And then their eyes just lit up because they saw that this had sort of an economic opportunity. And then they started telling me, yes, my piece of property has clay here and my piece of property has clay over there. So I think this could also be a way to, you know, not on a large scale, but to start getting them back towards some of their crafts that they used to produce, because now all of their plates are plastic, horrible things from China. And I tell them,
so the craftsmanship was also an important topic that we are dealing with right now with our students. And we had a great lecture from Michel Traxler, a design duo from Vienna, but they were actually working on this kind of resources and craftsmanship and / clay stone realities in a couple of exhibitions in an extraordinary way. So I think, you know, it's happening everywhere, and we have to address that as well. Eva, do you have a final question maybe, or your...
No, I I would only thank you again, Elisa, for the great lecture. And
no, my pleasure.
Yeah, I think it was really great for our students to see how things are really done, like what are the single steps of each project, not only construction wise, but also, yeah, the social agency that you showed quite well. I think this was, yeah, a really, really good input for our students. Thank you again.
Okay.
Thanks, Eva, for the comment. I'll just end up with the last question from YouTube, which is a little bit more informal, and then we will somehow slowly depart. The question is why you didn't choose a colored design for the church to bring more life in this building. You
mean like stained glass windows or something like that, I suppose.
I don't know what is meant, but it's definitely the lack of color which is, you know, challenged or questioned.
Yeah, it's no, it's a valid question, and I guess it's you know, this drive to be very pragmatic in terms of the materials, and the color, I have no doubt, will come because they have a tendency to decorate. They have a tendency to have their own, you know, statues of saints and pieces that they're going to bring in. Every time I've been to a mass, they fill the place with flowers. So yeah, I think the color is there to become their addition and their way of expressing like their appropriation of the site. It wasn't an intentional omission on my part. I did definitely not think that it was appropriate to bring in glass of any kind, that it should just remain you know, solids and voids. It wasn't necessary to bring glass in. And then other ways of bringing material color would have been paint, which is also just a problem because the paint chips away and paint needs maintenance. So these surfaces are maintenance free as much as possible. Yeah.
No, I think it's a great response, because anyway, I mean, just knowing a little bit about the Latin culture and also from the picture that you have shown us, color is part of every celebration and every kind of event. Yeah. And I think then these colors which are brought in at that time and then with the colors that they have on themselves are the colors that are actually even more vivid on this kind of background of solid and voids, as you said. So yeah, Lisa, I could chat with you live or publicly or in publicly forever. I'm so happy we were even able to do this as video.
Yeah, it was fun. It was great.
Thank you for your time. We will definitely get back to you when we progress with the students, but I think it was just really far more than for our student group. And actually it was so important to understand from this kind of Central European perspective, the challenges that you are dealing with your practice and foundation in Venezuela, and also what we could learn from, because I think we should be learning from this kind of low cost, low tech approach, with really understanding each brick and each hour of unskilled labor, which could be implemented far more in our societies, even within the very complex laws which are, forbidding this kind of things. But still, I think we have so much to push for on a larger agenda. So I think it's a great contribution to challenge our minds further in that direction. So yeah, I thank you deeply for your time. And I hope we will have another opportunity to somehow exchange the thoughts on so many topics which are very relevant.
No, I certainly hope so too. I mean, and I included the images of Venezuela at the beginning to get you guys excited of hopefully coming someday when things are better.
No, we are definitely coming to see that. We have to experience at least your work live and to somehow understand the culture. So take care, all best, and see you soon.
Okay, ciao, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.